Matthew serves as the Minneapolis Institute of Arts Deputy Director and Chief Curator, and he plays a key role in charting the museum's strategic vision. He administers 5 curatorial departments, as well as registration and the museum's research library. Welch joined the museum in a year that I won't mention as its curator of Japanese and Korean art some time ago, let's just put it that way. During his time as curator, he generated 11 exhibitions, 4 of which have toured nationally or internationally. He's authored 6 books and contributed many essays to other publications. In 19-something, he expanded the display of Japanese art at the museum from 2 to 9 galleries, and in 2000-something, he unveiled 6 additional galleries, making the Japanese art display at the MIA one of the largest in the country. And it is large. Having been there, it's extraordinary. The museum is extraordinary. You should definitely make an effort to go and visit if you haven't seen it recently. He also established the museum's first gallery devoted to Korean art. The museum's collection of Japanese and Korean art has grown 173% under his stewardship to over 8,500 works. For his work in the field of Japanese art and culture, he was awarded the Japanese Foreign Ministry's commendation in 20-something. Welch earned his BA in Art History and English at Trinity University in San Antonio and his MA and Ph.D. from the University of Kansas. He spent 4 years in the Department of Letters at Kyoto University as a Fulbright Research Fellow, and he's an alumnus of the Center for Curatorial Leadership. Before I have him come up, I just wanted to say as a reminder that Joan Key, who will be our speaker in February, is going to be giving her lecture on Friday instead of Thursday because she had a conflict. So if you're interested in coming to her lecture, just make a special note to yourself that it's actually on Friday, February 2nd, and not on Thursday. But with that, please help me welcome Matthew to the stage.
Thank you, Ike, and thank you everyone for being here. I just arrived yesterday, and I have to say everyone has been so remarkably kind. Your weather is spectacular. It is 15 degrees in Minneapolis, and we're heading to negative 40, so I'll be back. Well, I wanted to start this evening's presentation a little bit differently. See if I can figure out the controls here. Yep. Where am I pointing?
It's not working. Oh, so can you use your keys instead?
Nope.
Mayday.
It's not going to be fun for you if I have to act this out.
Does anybody feel like performing?
We just need to open this again. Can we just reopen the file?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Maybe it was asleep too long.
Go full.
There we go.
Sorry.
No worries. Okay, so, yeah. So, okay. I'm going to start this evening's presentation a little bit unusually, not with a work of Japanese art, but by a work produced by the British artist Richard Hamilton. And this work debuted at the Birmingham Icon Gallery in 1956. And I think scholars unanimously designate this piece as the beginning of pop art as we know it in the West. And, Richard Hamilton, I think, was really prescient in his interpretation of what was happening in the 1950s and then subsequently in the 1960s. He said this about pop art: "Tomorrow can only extend the range of present day by visual experience. What is needed is not a definition of meaningful imagery, but the development of our perceptive potentialities to accept and utilize the continual enrichment of visual material." If you think about it, it was incredibly prescient. At that time in the 1950s, we didn't have the internet. Imagine. Now, thankfully, Richard Hamilton lives until 2011. He dies at the age of 89. So he experienced that. But if you just consider the flood of visual material that we're experiencing now, this has certainly come true. And he had this to say about what pop art is really about. Pop art is popular, transient, expendable, low cost, mass-produced, young, witty, sexy, gimmicky, glamorous, and big business. And my point in bringing this up is that all of these superlatives equally apply to an artistic movement that occurred in Japan's Edo period, beginning in the 17th century, that manifested absolutely all of these characteristics. And that's what I want to tell you a little bit about tonight. So Japan during the 17th century entered into a period of incredible protracted peace that lasted over 200 years. And it was largely due to the policies set into effect by this man, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first shogun of the Tokugawa house and the ruling house during this Edo period. Now, peace was achieved at some expense, however. It was a repressive government, and there were many edicts that were passed, but I'll just mention several things that resulted in this era of protracted peace. The first is the expulsion of foreigners. The Japanese, and Ieyasu in particular, saw that the presence particularly of foreign priests was a prelude to colonization. And so one of the first things they did was to expel foreigners from Japan and force priests to leave or actually executed them or forced them to apostatize. So they rid the country of foreigners. They restricted trade. There was some trade. They left the port of Nagasaki open. However, the Dutch and Portuguese traders that came were secluded to the island of Dejima off the coast and were not allowed onto the mainland unless they were escorted. And occasionally they were escorted all the way from the far south, all the way to the far north to be in audience with the shogun himself. Tokugawa Ieyasu required a system of alternate attendants. Now this sounds simple, but it's diabolical because he had a country full of feudal lords that ruled their individual domains, but he forced them to make the trip to Edo, all the way to the deep north, his stronghold, once a year, and then return to visit and be in attendance at court. They could then return to the provinces for 6 months, but they left their families in Edo. So if any of them thought about moving against the government, their families would be executed. It was a really effective measure, right? Peace for over 200 years. And the final thing was a policy of isolationism. I mentioned that foreigners were expelled from the country, but this continued then for the next 200 years. Foreigners were not welcome in Japan. Sailors who were shipwrecked and washed up on their shores were either put on the next boat out or also executed or jailed. Now, what did this mean? Well, I mentioned that Tokugawa Ieyasu chose the fishing village of Edo to set up his stronghold. This is a period map of the 19th century map of the city of Edo. Those big characters that you see there are Shiro, which means castle. So this was the shogun's stronghold. And as you can see, it was a city of canals, right? But the canals also served as sort of fortifications for the castle itself. So never successfully attacked. There were no movement against the shogun during the entire Tokugawa period. So this peace and prosperity brought in unbelievable growth to the economy. By 1721, Tokyo had 1 million residents. making it the largest city in the world at that time. London, just by way of comparison, wouldn't reach that level of population for another 100 years. Similar growth took place in other cities like Osaka, Nagasaki, Kobe, and Hiroshima. Now, during this period of peace, you have to understand also that prior to this period, there was 100 years of fighting in Japan as these feudal warlords vied for supremacy. So finally, the country was at peace. The townspeople, ordinary people, could enjoy festivals were resurrected. They could grow crops and not surrender them. Their villages weren't being burned. Life seemed pretty good with this burgeoning economy. And so we see here a print by Tori Kiyanaga that sort of represents one of these festivals. This is the Great Sanno Festival, held every other year in the city of Edo to commemorate the protector of the city, the sort of Shinto deity that protects Tokyo itself. And so here they are out all fancily dressed up and enjoying this parade through the city, visiting various strategic spots so that blessings were sort of bestowed on the city itself to protect it from warfare, fires, and any number of calamities. So life seemed pretty good. Now, interestingly, the Japanese word for the Buddhist concept for life is often read ukiyo. We're using this character that you see here on the left. That's uki, and this is yo. So it doesn't mean floating world, it means miserable world. Right? So this is an old Buddhist concept. So this word existed. Because in Buddhism, right, a basic tenet is that life is miserable. And the point is, through enlightenment, to escape that continuous cycle of birth and death and rebirth, rather. So the Buddhist concept is a miserable world. But a writer in the 17th century, Asai Ryoi, wrote a book called the Ukiyo-e Tales of the Floating World. And instead of writing it that way, he wrote it this way. It's pronounced the same way, ukiyo, but in this case it means floating. And so what does he mean by that? And in the preface to the Ukiyo-e, to the Tales of the Floating World, he had this to say: living only for the moment, turning our full attention to the pleasures of the moon, the snow, the cherry blossoms, and the maple leaves. Singing songs, drinking wine, diverting ourselves by just floating like a gourd on the river. This is the ukiyo. This is the floating world. So it's a very different concept, right? He's conveying that life is pretty good right now. And so then if we attach one more character to it, I promise I won't make you learn Japanese tonight. If we attach one more character, this is ukiyo-e, pictures. So pictures of the floating world, and that's our topic. Okay, so the first pictures of the floating world then, and this is amazingly, with this piece came also a rise in education. Every village had a tera koya. Tera is temple, and koya is school. So the Buddhist priests were charged with educating the public. And so everyone in Japan, almost everyone, was learning to read in the 17th century, making it one of the most educated and literate societies in the world at that time. And they did something that was a little bit sneaky, but brilliant. That is, educated Japanese throughout Japanese history learned to read and write in Chinese. The Japanese system was adopted to work with Chinese characters, but you had to really be literate in Chinese in order to understand written Japanese. Well, most people couldn't read Chinese, and so they began to write small phonetic script next to Chinese characters, so you could sound it out. And since it was written in the vernacular, suddenly you could read too. So these novels were called kanazoshi. That phonetic script is called kana, and you can see it up above on both of these. So these are tales of the floating world, but written in a script that most Japanese could understand at this period. It wasn't long, however, before these makers of woodblock printed books realized the potential of doing single sheet images, use the whole page for their composition. And it's no surprise, too, that this was an extremely stratified society. Merchants and townsmen who served the populations of these growing cities couldn't advance in the political order, right? If you were born to the merchant class, the lowest class of society, you stayed there your entire life. But yet they became the wealthiest members of the society because of the growth of the economy. They couldn't advance politically or socially, so they had to find ways to spend their wealth. They could do that by dressing themselves in gorgeous costumes, although not too much, because it would be unseemly for a mere merchant to be overly dressed. They could have resplendent houses, but not too much, because if it was too showy, the government would confiscate it. So they had to find outlets for their wealth, and they turned to all of the pleasures that the world could offer. And particularly in the city of Edo, this involved the licensed pleasure quarters. These are the licensed brothels that were at first on the outskirts of the city, a place called the Yoshiwara, the Field of Reeds. And this is basically, this book by Okamura Masanobu is basically a guidebook to the Yoshiwara, showing pictures of some 24 of the beauties whose, if you had enough money, whose presence you could enjoy. And so this is an image of the beauty Wakoku. It says here, Wakoku. That's the crest of her house. So just a black and white print, not colored in any way yet, but it gives us great insight to how dramatic these women were dressed. Look at their costume, giant crows on this finely woven silk as she sits in one of these opulent interiors. It didn't take long for woodblock print producers to understand that if they made them a little prettier, they could sell them for more. Remember, right? Pop art is also big business. So the next stage we move to, also by Okamura Masanobu, then, are more deluxe publications, also printed in black and white, but before they're marketed, they're hand-colored. And so these are colored in with basically watercolor, making it look even more special. And the other thing that's happening is that these are witty publications. There's often a kind of double entendre here. So here we see in the center is a male client at one of these brothels, and he's flanked by the two people that are entertaining him, a female prostitute to the back and a male prostitute in front of him. This was not unusual in the Edo period. If you could afford the pleasures of the world, they were there for you. And so that in and of itself is not so witty. What's witty is the poem that's written over to the side. And it goes something like this. The scent of plum blossoms bring the first smile to guardian kings. Now, what does that mean, guardian kings? Well, in your own galleries, you have the head of two Nyo, right? The two guardian figures that flank the entrance to the temple. Well, he's likening these prostitutes to the guardian figures. They're guardians of pleasure then. So remember, that other thing about pop art is that it's irreverent. They're talking about Buddhism. They're talking about the major religion in Japan now, and he's punning this way about that faith. So very witty, very irreverent. Now, the year 1765 is a pivotal one in Japan because, or in the ukiyo-e, because of the advent of full color printing. Prior to this time, the woodblock print publishers understood how they could add one or two printed colors to the woodblock. And this is a very simple idea. It's sort of surprising they didn't develop it before this. But if you can imagine, I'm not going to go too much into the technicalities of woodblock printing, but you can imagine an artist makes a design, draws it out in black ink on paper. The woodblock carver then takes that image and pastes it face down on a block of wood. The paste makes the paper transparent, so he then can carve through the paper, destroying the original drawing, leaving only the black lines in high relief. Right? Now, if you want to produce several wood blocks with different colors, you need to line up your paper precisely. So the way to do that is to make one raised section along one edge and a corner. So then you could pull several prints. For each color that you see, this yellow, for example, would require one woodblock. This color would require another one. But you would pull several black and white prints and then carve away everything except that color, right? And so then as you started your production, you'd line up all of your blocks, print the black, let it dry a bit, move it on to the next block, print the yellow, move it on, print the brown, and so on. Each time, because of the precision of the carving and those guides, those kento, the registration would be perfect. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. But why? How did this happen? Who financed it? Why was this occurring in Japan? Well, sometimes prints weren't necessarily financially viable, but if they were commissioned privately, in this case by a private poetry society, they could go to this sort of extravagant means. Now, I mentioned there's an element of subversion already, right? The government strictly regulated who could produce a calendar. It seems ridiculous, right? We have calendars everywhere. We're coming up on the holidays. Well, there'll be calendars on every street corner. But in the Edo period, it was believed that if you got the calendar wrong, you could cast the cosmos into chaos, right? So it was a government duty to produce calendars. Well, these artists didn't really believe that, but they also understood that most people didn't need a full calendar. They just needed to know which months were long and which months were short, which had 29 days, which had 30 days, right? And by the old lunar calendar. So this, in fact, is a calendar print, privately commissioned with a huge budget so that they could produce it in a full color way. And so the cross-hatching of the bamboo leaves indicate which months are long, right? And so I see 8 here, 10 there, 6, 3, 1, 5, right? So suddenly you know which months are the big months, and you can calculate it yourself. Now, this print has been exposed to too much light. Keep in mind that these pigments are natural pigments at this point, so often extremely light sensitive, some of them not so much, but with overexposure, that color evaporates. And that's really what you're seeing here. This was a much more colorful print. It would have been something like this. Right? So this is also a design by Harunobu, showing courtesans on parade. It's a way of advertising their houses. Courtesans would periodically dress up in their fineries to be accompanied by lower-ranking prostitutes, male attendants, and so on, and would go on promenade down the main thoroughfare through the Yoshiwara. And if this looks a little bit static, it's because in order to really show off the fineries, they walked in a manner that's called the figure 8. You can see they wear high geta, and so the women would kick their robes like this and then kick the other way, creating a kind of figure 8. And that would cause the robes to flare open, showing the various layers and various patterns that you see there. But I wanted to show this to you because it gives you that sense of how colorful these were. The Japanese actually called them nishiki-e, brocade prints, because of that. So it could require up to 20 separately carved blocks in order to achieve this level of color. And then if they were very clever about it, they could do several additional techniques, like double printing with the same block. So if you printed safflower pink over dayflower blue, you would end up with purple, that kind of thing. So to expand the range of color even more. Or you could blind print, that is no coloration at all, simply rubbing the baron on the paper would give a raised texture or pattern. Now, Harunobu was one of the great masters then of the nishiki-e, these brocade prints. Some of them are extremely witty, some of them gently so. In this case, 2 young lovers have been up too long, enjoying each other's company, and so they're feeding the rooster here sake so that he won't wake them up early in the morning. So light, enjoyable subjects. Or in this case, one that required a little bit of knowledge. On the one hand, it looks like we have a young woman in this tea house who's a little bit disheveled, maybe saying goodbye to a customer or greeting a customer, looks something like that. But in fact, a knowledgeable Japanese of the period would have recognized this as the tale of Ibaraki. So Ibaraki was a demoness who haunted Rashomon, the southern gate to the city of Kyoto. And his feudal lord asked Watanabe no Tsuna, a famous warrior, to go slay the demon. So he went to the gate and waited at night, and it was a rainy, rainy night, so he had his umbrella. And finally, there was some travelers came along, and the demoness appeared. And so he gets into a fight and doesn't manage to kill her, but he manages to slice off her arm. He takes the arm home, keeps it in a casket as a kind of trophy, and after several days, there was a knock at the door late at night, and he answers it, and it's an old woman saying, "Oh my gosh, you're the fabulous warrior who cut off Ibaraki's arm. Show me your trophy." And when he opens the casket, the old woman grabs the arm, transforms into the demoness that she is, and flees into the night. And so a painted screen that we have in the collection of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts shows Ibaraki you see her with her arm, looking back over her shoulder to make sure that Watanabe Tsuna is not pursuing her. So if we return to this print, then it has an entirely different meaning, right? So this then is a kind of mitate-e, as the Japanese say, a kind of parody of that story. So here's Watanabe no Tsuna with his umbrella because of the rainy night. The woman who's not showing one hand, it's in her robe, and her hair's a little disheveled, suggesting the tussle that took place. And if you're still not getting it, he calls the tea shop the Ibarakiya, right? So making the illusion very clear. Okay, so if we fast forward about 20 years, if you looked at those images of Harunobu, you see that those figures are rather doll-like, right? Very slight, sort of impossible waif-like figures. But 20 years later, in the hands of an artist known as Tori Kiyonaga of the Tori school, the figures have a newfound corporeality. The Japanese are beginning to have some access to Western imported lithographs and so on. And so they're beginning to be a little bit influenced, and they turn and twist in space in a way that's new, in a way that suggests volume. The other thing that's happening is the Japanese are becoming very clever of skirting the government strictures against opulence in the floating world. And so the government decreed that prints could only be a single sheet, that could only be a certain size, right? The Japanese could make paper that was much larger. Prints theoretically could be huge. The government thought that that was unseemly for commoners to be enjoying art in that way, and so limited the size. Easy enough to get around, produce a triptych, right? Or even larger compositions were produced as well. So in this case, we have this glorious composition really suggesting the pleasures of the floating world. So in the summertime in Kyoto, over the Kamo River, temporary platforms are set up so that if you have enough money, you can hire a whole bevy of women to come entertain you on a platform over the river. It's unbelievably hot and humid, but there's cooling breezes that come off the water, and so you can enjoy a night of revelry. And so here you could have to imagine yourself as the male customer who's just arriving to this vision that you see before you of all these beautifully arrayed women. And again, the printing technique is unbelievable. Capturing, this is almost like a veritable encyclopedia of textile design of the period, right? But also a variety of printing techniques. And I think the standing woman, you can see 2 shades of black. Remember, again, this is summertime, so she's wearing a sheer black kimono, and where the fabric overlaps is where the artist carefully notes a darker color to suggest that sheerness. So we're becoming very adept. The other thing I wanted to mention with this is the name that we associate with this print is Tori Kiyonaga. He is the artist who drew the original concept for this, but the artist does not produce the print, right? The artist then turns that print over to a woodblock carver. So a good deal of the quality of these prints is due to the skill of these carvers. We know that carvers had at least a 10-year apprenticeship. Even then, within a carving studio, the masters would attend to things like hands, the hairlines that you see are so beautifully rendered, and then maybe studio assistants could do other portions of it. And then finally, once the wood blocks are all carved, it's turned over to a printer who specializes in coloration, right? The artist himself may or may not designate the colors and where they should be, or often, and we have some evidence of this, would only summarily indicate color, not specifically. It was really up to the printer to choose this beautiful array that you see here. So it's really this combination of labor that comes together to produce prints of this quality. Now, the next great figure that comes onto the scene is Kitagawa Utamaro. And Utamaro is brilliant. We know very little about his life. He produced about 2,000 prints. The thing that we credit to him to doing is kind of telescoping in on these figures. And so instead of showing, and he did show full figures, but he also began to get closer to his subject. He also began to inject them with a bit of realism. That is, you can actually discern the features of certain women or certain subjects within his prints, rather than it being a sort of generic face. And so this is the courtesan Hanaogi, and she was known for appearing extremely chaste and sweet and innocent. And indeed, he sort of captures that here. I mentioned earlier that we say courtesan, we say prostitute. In the Yoshiwara, this was an extremely stratified group, and the women who achieved the highest level, the most beautiful women, were often unattainable to only the most moneyed of merchants, right? And even then, you'd have to spend enormous sums to spend the evening with this woman. So, you wouldn't just merely cut a deal and go off to the brothel. Instead, often you would have to entertain her, seduce her over a period of weeks, if not months, sending gifts, inviting her to dinners, arranging parties, all the while hemorrhaging money in the floating world, right? This was sort of the point. And only after that could you hope to gain admission to her bedchamber. And even then, for the highest ranking of these courtesans, she could refuse at any point along the way. Now, I mentioned those troublesome restrictions and censorship of this material. And so in one of the reforms, the government decreed that only courtesans could be named in prints. Other women could not be specifically named. But of course, there were all kinds of women that operated in the Yoshiwara, common tea house maids, for example, but it was illegal then to name them. And so in this case, Tomimoto Toyohina was a serving girl who was renowned for her beauty, but she was basically just a waitress within the Yoshiwara. But Utamaro here depicts her telescoping in even closer. So it becomes this very dramatic so-called okubie, big-headed print. So you're right up as if you're having audience with her. But who is she? Well, he can't name her, but he embeds a puzzle up here. So up on the top, you see a box. That's a tomi. That's a lottery box. Tomi. Down below is duckweed, mo. Then there's a lantern, to. Tomimoto. All right, we're almost there. Toyo, lantern, to, yo, door, and then hina. Toyohina. So with a little bit of cleverness, they always found a way to circumvent these restrictions. Finally, the government was strictest when it came to political subversion. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Pornography, on the other hand, not so much. So remember that early print that I showed you with the gentleman being entertained by a young man and a young woman? That was the first plate to a set of 12. With each page, they became much more graphic. And this continued throughout the Edo period. The issue is the government repeatedly issued edicts against such pornography because it was corrupting to public morals. But never much enforced it. At some point, artists, out of abundance of caution, stopped putting their name on these productions, and printers also. Publication houses stopped including their name. They did on other things, but production proceeded apace. Another way of getting around that restriction is to make a depiction like this. So it's a fantastic composition. This is the abalone divers. These are these women who make their living by they have incredible lungs, being able to dive deep under the sea to harvest abalone. When they do so, of course, they disrobe, except wear these kind of red skirts. So it's a kind of seductive thing. They're bare-breasted, and yet, if questioned by the authorities, you could say, what? That's what I saw. That's what they do. Right? This isn't suggestive. And it occurs in any number of ways. So in this case, a very innocent looking scene, right? Where in Japan, if you needed a haircut, the barbers were itinerant. They would come through your village periodically. People would come out their front doors and sit down on the roadside and get their head shaved or a haircut. And so here, this weary young mother wants her little child's head shaved. Mercifully, he's fallen asleep. And so here's the barber going about his job. But of course, again, licentiously, her robe has fallen open. Right? So making it just ever so slightly titillating. As I mentioned, the government, not an entirely blind eye to that kind of production, but where they had no tolerance was any kind of political subversion. So this is an incredible triptych that was also produced by Utamaro. In 1803 or to 1804, and it shows the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So this is Tokugawa Ieyasu's predecessor, the ruling shogun before Ieyasu ushered in the Edo period. And here he is in the center of the composition, surrounded by beautiful women and page boys and so on, enjoying a picnic under the cherry trees. It looks innocent enough, except the government had issued an edict that you could not depict historic figures except from the distant past. And when I say distant past, I mean the 11th and 12th centuries, right? This was just 100 years earlier. So the idea being that, this looks as if Toyotomi Hideyoshi was a great guy. Maybe the Toyotomi house should have been the rulers of Japan, right? So it could stir the pot for insurrection. So for this, the great Utamaro, one of the greatest printmakers Japan has ever produced, was put in manacles and under house arrest for 50 days. He never quite recovered. He lived another 3 years and passed away in his 50s. Well, I've been talking a lot about the women of the floating world, but I wanted to change tracks a little bit and talk about the kabuki theater. So we've all heard of kabuki. Today it's synonymous with Japan. It's one of those things. But in fact, it was the second form of theatrical production in Japan. In the medieval era, what we know now as no drama came to the fore. And this is a very aristocratic form of drama. Have any of you seen a no performance? It's that extremely slow-moving form, often masked, but also usually moralistic tales. Because of some misdeed on earth, you pay the price through karma, right? So it was a very moralizing form of theater. But in the Edo period, kabuki began to emerge, and it has a very sketchy beginning. It begins with a fallen shrine priestess called Okuni, who gathers around her similarly fallen girls, and on makeshift stages during festivals, they would perform a kind of licentious dance. So here you see her. This is a detail from a folding screen. Here you see Okuni seated on, it's so exotic, on a chair, right? This is a Chinese imported chair, so it's very exotic, draped with a tiger skin, further exoticism, and then all of her girls then dancing rhythmically around her. And at the end of the performance, they would descend the stage in order to solicit the men that had gathered down below, right? So it didn't take long for the government to say, this is corrupting. So no, women cannot perform on the stage in this manner. So very quickly, Okuni's troupe was replaced by very young and beautiful young men. That too didn't go over well with the government because they performed in the same way. So in 1629, the edict was passed that only adult males could perform in the kabuki theater, and that is the tradition that continues to this day. The way you can often tell is that adult males in Japan had their pates shaved. Sometimes there's a little bag called burasaki that's put over it to disguises the bald spot. But if you see hair, it's a younger man. So adult males only for kabuki. So kabuki then is also, not the aristocratic form of entertainment. This is the plebeian kind. There are two types, ones that focused on military tales of betrayal and valor, and other ones that were so-called domestic dramas. The only equivalent I can think of is something like our soap operas, right? These are highly charged, often sexual tales of intrigue, of sort of stories that are taking place in the city around them, often sensational tales. And so in this case, this is the ill fate. This is a story of a double suicide. This young man is smitten with that courtesan over there. He's so smitten with her, he can't even just look upon her directly. He has to hide behind another woman to get a glimpse of her there. At this point, she's unaware of him. At first, he wants to try and ransom her out of his house, but he's just a low-ranking merchant, doesn't have the money, and so on. They try various things. Ultimately, in the tale, they can't find a way for him to buy her out of the house, and they together then commit suicide. The reason I bring this in, however, is just like in those images of women, images of actors begin first as black and white prints and then hand-colored prints, and that's what you're seeing here. These are hand-applied pigments, and in order to make it just a little more special, paste was applied to the lantern and the equivalent of glitter sprinkled on. So those little speckles you see, that originally that would have flickered then in the light. Okay, one of these, another example of one of these domestic dramas. In this case, this is the tale of Oshichi that you see over here on the left. She's this beautiful young woman whose family suffers a fire at their home. And so they repair then to a local temple to live until their house is repaired. And she falls in love with a young temple attendant there and wants to stay with him. And they fall in love, they take walks, everything. Life is beautiful for them. And then the house is ready. And Oshichi's family has to return home. So she's going to be separated from her love, Ukuta. A ruffian who hangs out around the temple gate hoping for handouts is this gentleman that you see here on the right, who convinces her that a smart plan would be to set fire to the house once they move back in so that it's damaged and she can move back to the temple. Well, there are many things that you can do in the Edo period to get in trouble, but maybe the worst of them is being accused of arson. Right? You can imagine these great cities with a population of over 1 million are made entirely of wood and paper. Right? And so fire was taken very seriously. Most men had to participate in the local fire brigade, that is, policing the streets at night, walking through at dusk with clappers to remind people to extinguish their fires. They took it very seriously. So arson was not acceptable, and Oshichi was taken to the Susukuna execution grounds and burned at the stake for her offense. So this was a sensational event that happened about 10 years before it was repurposed and told as a kabuki tale. And so here we see the ruffian and Oshichi. Again, in this case, she is a hand-colored print with, you see this word up here, urushi-e. Urushi in Japanese is lacquer. This isn't actually lacquer, but rather it's using a kind of paste printed over the surface. And so it gives it a kind of lustrous effect. And I'm sorry, you can really only see this. One of the beauties of Japanese prints is holding them in your hand, actually. This does them a little bit of a disservice. But you can turn it this way or that way, and you can see the blind printing, you can see that gaufrage, and you can see this urushie. Often there's a black on black pattern that shimmers when you turn the print in the light. And that's the case of his robe. There's a floral pattern there. You'll just have to trust me. So kabuki becomes, a spectacle for all to enjoy, all kinds of theatrical effects. If you were to ever have the chance, I highly encourage you to attend a kabuki. All kinds of, amazing theatrical effects take place on the stage, including transformations. In this case, this was an actor who specialized in portraying a wizard who could do two things. He could magically disappear. Of course, there's a trapdoor in the stage, but he could also turn into a giant toad. Okay, but it's that kind of quick change artistry where he would flip around and suddenly he has toad skin, as you see here. Or in this example, remember, this is by the same artist who did that incredible array of women on the platform over the Kamo River. Toriyuki Yanaga also did prints of actors. And what this scene shows is, this is a warrior print, and it's actually set in the 11th century, where there's two rival clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. And one of the Minamoto warriors becomes a traitor, and then, has to hide himself. And so he's pretending to fill the oil lanterns on the streets at night in the city of Kyoto, but he's discovered by this gentleman from the Minamoto troops. And so once he spies him, he begins to draw his sword. So this is just at that moment where he's going to cut him down. But this is no ordinary sword. This is a magical sword. So as it's pulled from its sheath, a clap of lightning happens up above. And so you can just imagine this in a kabuki theater, right? Suddenly smoke is up in the upper reaches of the stage, and there's a flash of light, and everyone gasps at this taking place. This incredible stagecraft captured in prints. Again, just like Utamaro, a famous Japanese woodblock printmaker, famous for his designs, but also famous because we know so very little about him. This is the artist Sharaku. He was only active for about 9 months, we know, because many of these prints are dated, from May of 1794 to January of 1795. In that time, he produced 144 print designs, incredibly rare. Many of these artists produced thousands, extremely high quality. He was working with the top printer of the day, so using very specialized materials. In this case, to make these prints even more special, printing the background with mica. So if you can imagine originally when you moved it in your hand, it would have shone with silver. And this, too, is a kabuki tale, one of those domestic dramas. This is a teacher of no drama to the shogun himself, to the feudal lord himself. But his daughter has had an illicit affair with a courtier. And so he, in punishment for her offense, has to be sent into exile. Well, in Japan, if you're sent into exile, it's tantamount to death. So many people opted for suicide in that case. And so he has made the fateful decision to kill himself. He's wringing his hands, as you see below. He's grimacing, but all the while, he's having to teach his lord how to perform no drama, as well as his protege. He needs to teach them because he'll no longer be around. And meanwhile, another design by Sharaku is that gentleman's wife, who is known, this actor is this very distinctive face. It's known from records that has this kind of very elongated face, very small, mincing eyes. But here's her looking very worried, understanding her husband's decision. And then finally, I just have to bring these in because it's something for me to brag about. The collection at the Minneapolis Institute of Art is not the largest in the country. There are many. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts has an impressively large collection, I think, of over 50,000 prints. The Art Institute of Chicago, some 30,000. We merely have, I think, 5,000 prints, but among them are some of the rarest images ever produced. And in this case, a protege of Sharaku, known as Kabukido Enkyo. And there are only 7 designs produced by this artist, and the museum owns 5 of them, including this set, which depicts, again, these are carriage drivers who ape the authority of their masters. And so they get into a tussle trying to jockey their carriages into place to advantage. In any case, rare, extremely rare okubiye, these big-headed dramatic prints. All right, so we're going to change tracks a little bit. And, as we enter the 19th century, the government is issuing edict after edict about trying to limit these ukiyo artists and their subject matter, particularly the beautiful women of the floating world and these kabuki actors, again, corrupting to public morals. Production does not stop. It continues right through the 19th century. But artists also begin to turn to other subject matter. And one of them is landscapes, particularly as it relates to travel. Now, I mentioned all those edicts, and one of the ways of controlling the population was to forbid them from traveling. Right? If you could travel, you could mount a military campaign, you could do all kinds of mischief. But people found a way of getting around that, just like other things, right? And one of the ways of doing that was to say, well, my mother is ill, and I hear that if I pray at the base of Mount Fuji, that's helpful for recovery. This is pre-modern Japan. You could get permission that way, right? And so suddenly people started to take to the road. But even if they couldn't, they would purchase woodblock prints and live vicariously through them to see their own country as they imagined artists saw them. And so one of the most popular series is by an artist known as Katsushika Hokusai, and it shows the 36 views of Mount Fuji. Now, Mount Fuji is not just a mountain in Japan, it's sort of remarkably symmetrical, conical shape, and is a sacred mountain. So this has additional meaning for the Japanese. But what a clever idea. So Fuji from various locations. In this case, the water wheels at Onden. This is an area of where there's a great river that used to operate these great water wheels for threshing. For the Tokyo Olympics in 1964, yes, I was there, Ike. They paved over this great river. Right? This is now part of Tokyo. It's beneath the concrete. It still exists, but this is part of modern-day Tokyo now. But in all of these images, then, Hokusai's approach to the composition is a dramatic one, often with motifs pushed to the foreground and then Fuji in the distant background, but also, interestingly, limiting his color palette for greater dramatic effect. And so you see here just a limited number, a yellow, a pale green, a darker green, in this brilliant blue color. In fact, this is Prussian blue that's imported into Japan right at the turn of the 19th century. And this brilliant blue is thought to be one of the reasons that landscapes become so popular. And so we see another example. Hokusai takes an interest in every aspect of life. He produces a volume after volume called the Hokusai manga, where he experiments with all kinds of things. How do people look when they're underwater, twisting that way and this way? How do dancers look when they move? All number of flora and fauna are depicted in his basic encyclopedia. But in this case, you see he's taken interest in all levels of society. Here, an itinerant monk. He has his shakuhachi, his hat, a higher-ranking daimyo because he's on a horse, palanquin carriers, and so on, taking an interest in all levels of society, with Fuji then in the background. And then, of course, the most famous of these being the Great Wave, in this case limiting the palette even more, just 2 shades of Prussian blue, and then there's a bit of pink up in the upper registers of the sky. And again, one of these brilliant, iconic compositions. There are waves down below in boats, but completely dwarfed by the power of nature. So popular was the series, in fact, that he added 10 more designs. So there's actually 46 views in the 36 views of Mount Fuji. But he turns his attention to, they're so popular, he starts to produce other series, including the Great Waterfalls of Japan, which there are 8 compositions. You can see that extreme graphic effect he's able to achieve through his style. And then a series that shows 11 bridges of Japan. 11 is a weird number, probably intended there to be 12, but we know of 11 that exist today. Most of them are real. Some of them were imaginary bridges. But you can see he's on a quest for these very dramatic compositions. This is in contrast to an artist who works concurrently with Hokusai, and this is Hiroshige. And Hiroshike's approach to the landscape is quite a different one. One, I have to say, that is much more poetic. He's much more concerned with the nuances of time of day, weather conditions, season, and so on. And so you see that really beautifully displayed in this depiction from the 53 stations of the Tokaido Road. So the Tokaido Road was a roadway that linked Edo in the far north with the historic capital of Kyoto. And so there were 53 stops along the way where the shogun's troops could stop, water their horses, find lodging, and so on. And then with the entree point in Edo and the end in Kyoto, it's 55, right? 55 prints. But again, the series became wildly popular. And so Hiroshige went on to add several additional compositions. This one, A Rainstorm at Shono. You see where he's achieving just through brilliant printing effects, the driving rain up above and the bamboo cast in shadow. Or what happens then, the quietude of a snowfall, where he's expunged almost all color from the composition, save for what these travelers are wearing. And again, the Japanese were able to travel vicarious this way. They could imagine themselves being in this place. Or the dramaticism of the mountains that surround Lake Hakone. And I mentioned those samurai having to go and serve in alternate attendants in Edo. And so here embedded in the mountain pass, you see their hats as the procession makes its way to the north. Again, there seemed to be an unsatiable appetite on the part of the public for these views. And, again, printmaking is big business. So if people would spend the money to acquire 36 views of Mount Fuji, then they would buy 46 views of Fuji. Why don't we make 100 views of Edo? Right? And in fact, people did, and they would collect them. Keep in mind, one of the reasons some of these prints look so fresh, or many prints look so fresh, the Japanese did not frame them. They didn't display them on their walls. They instead would tip them into albums, right? So these are really meant to be viewed as books. They're closed and protected from light and dirt and so on. The worst thing in Japan, of course, is insects during the humid months, but many of them are very fresh because they're protected within books. But an example from the 100 Views of Edo, this is the opening of Ryokoku Bridge, and so the firework display that takes place. All, again, these entertainments that were enjoyed by the urban dwellers in these great cities. So as we continue into the 19th century, I just wanted to show you some of the ways that this rising middle class passed time. There were the emergence of poetry societies, just like book clubs now. You could join a poetry society, meet at a local restaurant on a weekly basis, celebrate the incoming New Year's and so on. And to commemorate an event like New Year's, you might commission a private print. These are so-called surimono. So they look a little bit different from those commercial publications that you often see associated with the floating world. In this case, folktale becomes the topic, and you can see the colors are softer, often brilliantly painted or printed, and also include the poems of the members of the Poetry Society. So this would be your keepsake at the end of the year. Right? And so this is the story of Hanasaki Jiji, who is an old man and a woman who have a pet dog, and the dog digs in the garden and discovers gold. And so the neighbor, they think it's a magic dog. And so the neighbor asks to borrow the dog, and the dog doesn't discover any gold in his garden, so he kills the dog. So, of course, the old couple, Hanasaki Jiji, is heartbroken, but the dog appears to him in a dream, and it tells him to cut down the cherry tree and make a mortar out of it for pounding rice. And so they dutifully do this, and when they pound the rice, it turns into gold. And so, again, the neighbor steals the mortar, tries to pound rice, and it turns into sour berries, right? So he burns the mortar. The ashes fly into the face of a traveling lord, so he's imprisoned. Meanwhile, those ashes that drift over to Hanasaki Jiji's property turn into gold. Yes. So this kind of felicitous story then would be appropriate for New Year's. Or in this case, by the middle of the even in the 18th century, in the 19th century, certainly, the Japanese were importing through the port of Nagasaki Western books on anatomical studies, botanical studies, and so on. And so took a keen interest in the variety of plants that were available. In fact, there were entire markets devoted to morning glories, where you could get the latest cultivar, or in this case, chrysanthemums. And one of Hokusai's rare series is his so-called large flower series. It's a large 4-print. But again, far from the sort of illicit subject matters of the floating world, but the kind of thing that captivated the people of the Edo period. Or also, even again, a very literate society, interest in classical Japan, right? This is an image of Lady Murasaki Shikibu, who supposedly wrote the first novel created in the world, right? This is the Tale of Genji in the 11th century. And she is said to have conceived the idea for writing the Tale of Genji when she was traveling and stopped for the night at Ishiyama Temple. And so here she is leaning on a writing desk, the balustrade there, looking out into the evening, and conceives of this great tale. Or ghost stories. Right? So it was a popular thing, particularly in summer, to gather all of your friends together for a drinking party and to tell ghost stories. And the idea being that the creepier the story, the more you would be chilled and would forget the fact that it's so hot and humid. So this is a brilliant composition by Hokusai. This is the story of Kohara Koheiji, whose wife has an affair on him, falls in love with her lover, and they contrive to murder him. They're successful, throw his body into a river, but here he is returning at night, and it's even creepier. You're gonna get a tingle down your spine when you realize that what's happening is he's pulling back the mosquito netting over her bed. Or the story of the manner dishes of Okiku, who is a maid in a feudal warlord's household, and he is wealthy, so he's able to collect these rare blue and white Chinese plates or dishes, and inadvertently one evening she breaks one while preparing dinner, and he's so outraged he beats her and throws her down a well. And so here she is, her ghost arising from the well, in which she counts the plates before issuing a screech and disappearing back into the well until it drives the Lord to distraction. Okay, so again, I want to change tracks a little bit and talk about the sort of abiding impact of Japanese prints on artists even to today. I mean, I think that you're very aware of impressionist artists importing woodblock prints into Paris, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, and having a huge impact on their compositions, on the use of color, even subject matter. I think Toulouse-Lautrec and his images of the women of the prostitution quarters in Paris, but In fact, there are contemporary artists active today who are also inspired by images of the floating world. And Masami Teruoka is one of them. Masami Teruoka came to the United States, immigrated to the United States in 1961, attended the Otis School of Art and Design, and harkens back to ukiyo-e then, but it's a social commentary on the sort of imposed tastes of American culture through globalization. So this print is entitled 31 Flavors Invading Japan. Teruoka, by the way, is still alive and lives in Hawaii. I think he's 89. Or in this case, Yoshitomo Nara, who's born actually in 1958, it's not there, but adulterating a Japanese print. So we saw the print by Sharaku already on the left, but he's adulterating it into calling it punk ebisu, and so giving him spiky shoulders and spiky hair and an earring and a skull finger ring. This might be a slight reference because these kabuki lineages endure. And so I think, I think Ebiso that we saw over there is Ebiso the second, and they're now Ebiso the 15th is active in Japan, and he's very rakish. And so this might actually be something of a reference to the contemporary Ebiso. Well, in this case, Iona Rocio Brown is an African-American artist who lives and works in New York. And she was sort of scandalized and upset to discover that in the late 90s, there's a kind of movement among young people in Japan for darkening their faces, basically something called ganguro, face darkening. And, we have a long history of blackface in this country. And so she was disturbed and wanted to know more about this and actually got a grant to go to Japan to interview these youngsters who were sometimes applying makeup, but more often than not attending tanning salons to darken their skin. And what she discovered was that they were doing it out of admiration for their hip hop and rap idols. And so we're aping that kind of culture. And so she began to work this out through a series of images. In this case, she's basing her design on the woodblock print that you see here on the left with some changes, right? So rather than a sword, he holds a money bag with a dollar symbol on it. His pants are slung low over his hip, revealing his underwear, of course. He wears a do-rag, and then a splotch of dark face makeup. Or in this case, very near to you, Gajin Fujita lives and works in New York and is the head of a street graffiti gang. And so in this case, they're called his crew. And so here he's naming it, crew down below. And this is all the members of his group, if you will. And most of them have, in very much ukiyo-e style, have the crests of their families on their garb. But in this case, rather than that, he's sort of suggesting the Raiders, right? But playfully changes the patch from the right eye to the left eye. It's not quite right. Instead of Raiders, Ronin are written across the top of the patch. Ronin in Japan is a masterless samurai. If your lord is killed in battle or something like that, you become disenfranchised. And so he's likening these subcultures in the United States, like graffiti gangs, to the disenfranchised Ronin of Edo period Japan. Julian, one of my favorite artists, Julian Opie, the British artist, I was delighted to discover is a massive collector of Japanese woodblock prints, and in fact, a few years ago, curated his own exhibition. But he has this very clean style, I think you may have seen them, focusing on urban or urbane people, sometimes animated, sometimes not, but always with this very pared down color palette and these heavy bounding lines that he traces to the influence of woodblock prints. So both in subject matter and distantly by style, he's related back to woodblock prints. The artist Tabaimo is a video artist who rejects the kind of slickness of manga and anime and instead hand sketches her videos. And in this case, it's the sort of naked backside of a man that sort of suggests the Japanese baths, and he has on him a tattoo of Hokusai's large flowers that you see there. But what happens in the video is that the flowers begin to drop petals, and then the man himself disintegrates. So it becomes all about the transience of life. Or Emily Allchurch, the British artist Emily Allchurch, who also similarly received a grant to study in Japan. Her approach to media is to take hundreds of thousands of photographs and then to restitch them together based on historic compositions. So in this case, she's basing her design on one of Hiroshike's 100 Views of Edo, but in this case has taken literally thousands of images in Japan at that place and then builds them together. And so now we have the distant city of Tokyo in the background, of course the cherry tree, but a few homeless people down in the park below. So totally updating it. And then the artist Chiho Aoshima, who works with in Kaikai Kiki Studio in Tokyo, does these amazing animations. This is from a video called City Glow, where she anthropomorphizes the towers of Tokyo, turning them into worm-like creatures, and they sway in a way that is seemingly benign and friendly in that sort of manga-like way, but then as the time of day changes to night, they turn into sort of demons, and the city transforms into a kind of graveyard. And so it's a commentary on, man's relationship with nature, or tenuous relationship with nature as we encroach upon it. And this is the installation at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. It's a 5-channel video production, and so these are actually 5 projections stitched together. Thank you. Sure. Happy to take some questions. Yeah, Bob.
So many of the prints you showed were bequests of Richard Gale. Can you tell us a little about that here in Minneapolis?
So, I swear that wasn't prepared. Yeah, so Mr. Marshall asked, many of the prints I had noted were bequest of Richard P. Gale. So how'd that happen? Well, we have many donors at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, but for the print collection, there were 2 in particular that were pivotal. The first is Richard P. Gale, who you see with Eleanor Roosevelt there on the left. He actually was a state senator in Minneapolis, ran a newspaper company, but became a collector of Japanese woodblock prints. And he really was a collector's collector. He limited himself to about 300 designs and was constantly trading up. So in the Gale collection are some of the rarest woodblock prints known in any collection. And on his death in 1974, he bequeathed them to the museum. Louis Hill, on the other hand, was the opposite kind of collector. He just loved Japan and loved woodblock prints, and so bought them by the armloads. Often he would just order them, there was no online, but he would order them from Japanese dealers. They would just arrive in a box, and he would delight in studying them, labeling them, and cataloging them himself. And so even today, we have his distinctive scrawl on the mats of the prints, and he gave almost 3,000 compositions. He had a particular passion for Hiroshike. And so 2,000 of those are Hiroshike woodblock prints. Yeah. Sir?
So when these artists like Hiroshige and Hokusai, they would make these woodblock prints,
Yeah.
they made multiple copies of each one, so there's lots of them out there.
That's correct. There are lots. So this notion of how many woodblock prints were created from a design. But remember, it's all about business. And so the initial run usually was quite small because they weren't sure how many would sell. They didn't know if a print would be popular. And then if it was popular, it would go into a second edition, a third edition. Now the editions were never numbered. So it's a little bit difficult to know exactly when it was produced. This gets into connoisseurship of prints a little bit. You can imagine these are wood blocks, right? So each time you ink it up, the block becomes saturated with moisture. And then if you shelve it, it dries out. And if you do that a few times, your registration starts to get off. So where the color meets the black line starts to show a little bit of light, right? And so then we know that's a later production. But also other things would happen. So, in the 53 stations of the Hokkaido Road, one of the most popular images was the first one at Nihonbashi. It shows the daimyo's procession leaving the city. Well, the early renditions of that print show that procession, but it shows 2 or 3 fishmongers hurrying to get out of the way, right? Over time, that was such a popular print that parts of those fishmongers broke, right? A hand, an elbow. And so the woodblock carver's answer to that was simply to cut them out and then carve new ones and slip them in. So overproduction, we have more and more fishmongers. The group grows over time. So there's that kind of adulteration that takes place, and that's part of the connoisseurship of
But
prints.
it's pretty easy to tell an original print, just like.
It is easier to tell an original print, which edition, much harder.
That one where the emperor with his 5 concubines,
Yes.
with amazing number of colors.
Amazing.
How many blocks?
Usually for a production like that, it's around 20. But again, remember, the same block can be used for 2 colors so that you get an additional color. I mean, yeah. Technical feat. Yeah.
Have many of the original blocks been maintained in?
Not many. And the reason for that was simply resources. So the highest quality of these were cherry trees that were grown in the shade. Right? So very tight grain. Those were extremely expensive. And so probably only available to those printers like Tsutaya that Sharaku and Utamaro worked with. Others used lesser quality wood. But the point is that the blocks began rather thick, but after a design had been printed and sold out and printed, and then people lost interest, they would carve off the surface and use it again for another design. So mostly they don't remain, but there are examples that do remain. You have one on display in your gallery. Sir.
I was in the Navy in 1958 in Japan, and everybody was buying Saito prints. So I don't know if he's very famous now or just okay.
Yes, Saito Kiyoshi, yes, absolutely. Saito Kiyoshi is a known artist, carries the woodblock print tradition forward. Subject matter is no longer the floating world, but it was an updated, more benign subject group. But absolutely, Saito Kiyoshi was and is a popular artist to collect. Sir.
I'm interested, given your overarching theme of pop culture, big business, etc. If I noticed you didn't have any Kuniyoshi, like Marvel Comics spectacular
Amazing.
superhero looking stuff.
Only because of time.
Only because of because it seems like it's so seemingly directly connected to later.
Absolutely, absolutely. Particularly on a popular level. I was sitting in my office one day working on an exhibition of prints, and a guard came in, Jason, and said, "So you like Japanese prints?" And I said, "Yes." And he lifted up his shirt, and there's a Kuniyoshi card going down. So yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You mentioned that the inks were natural pigments. Were those created by these artists, or was that another group of artists that were making and manufacturing inks?
The printers, yes. Yeah, and again, early on in production, it was almost all natural dyes and pigments. Later on, there are synthetic ones. And so particularly as we get into the 19th century, colors become a little bit more garish. There's first Prussian blue, then there's a red that's produced that, earlier red is usually iron-based, so it's a slightly brownish red, or you could use safflower, which is pink. But yeah, you get a blood red chemically in the 19th century. Yeah.
When you talk about the big business, who would, you talked about how the
poetry societies would commission a print, but who would start off a series and why, and how is it financed, and who got a cut?
The publisher. So the publisher is the one who fronts the money, and they have also the most at risk, right? Because if you produce this again, if you print 5,000 copies and you sell 3, it's not a successful venture. So they're constantly having to gauge that they are the ones that hire the artists, right? And so those artists that become more popular are able to command a bigger fee. But they hire the artists, they also hire the printers. But they also take the risk. They front the money for the production.
And do you know if the artist got royalties, or did they get a
No, flat fee.
for?
Flat fee.
Thank you. Matthew, could you talk a little bit about what happened or the evolution of the woodblock print after the Tokugawa period? I mean, did it continue to change, and were the techniques becoming more sophisticated, or did it?
It's very interesting. What happens in the Meiji period and after is that woodblock prints continue to be produced. So the medium continues to be produced. But the reason I didn't include them here is my feeling is it ceased to represent the ukiyo, right? The subject matter is very different. And so with the opening of Japan in 1858 and exposure to the West, the Japanese begin to adopt Western mores to a degree. Right, and so although the licensed pleasure quarters continue into the well into the 20th century, but nevertheless, in woodblock print production, there are images of beautiful women. They tend to be domestic women, wives, and so on. And when they're depicted unclothed, it's in the Western tradition of a woman at bath. So there's a dramatic shift from that kind of seductive quality to a much more chaste and proper view of Japan. And there's a kind of self-consciousness that takes place among Japanese artists at this time with the eyes of the world upon them. And so it's no longer that kind of brash subject matter. Kabuki actors too. Actors continued to be depicted, but they were no longer outside of society. Suddenly Kabuki theater in the Meiji period becomes the quintessential Japanese expression. And so they're famous, but not because they're being subversive, but for their artistry, frankly. So the nuance, the tenor is very different.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question. Yeah.
Me?
Sure.
You mentioned the mortar and pestle story, and it sounded very similar to the story of the magic millstone or the two brothers. I don't know if you know if there's any relation.
I don't. I'm sorry, I don't.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.